and be able to pick her out. We don't look anything alike. In fact, a number of people afterwards wanted to know if maybe one of us were actually adopted. But we are blood sisters. Not only are we not alike physically, but we're not alike personality-wise as well. Both really good people, but like we always say, she likes numbers and I like words. She was a beautiful seamstress and I was into sports. Mom always said if Jolene did something wrong, which maybe happened once, she said all you had to do was look at her and she would start crying. On the other hand, if Marla did something, Mom said I would often get a spanking and I would say, so that didn't hurt, and walk away. I'm sure parents, you probably look at your children as well and recognize the difference in them. We all have our ways of being disobedient, of maybe even falling into sin that plays out differently in each of our lives. God's mercy is the focus of all of our readings today. In our first reading, as Moses has led the Israelites into freedom, and he goes up the mountain to converse with God, and they get impatient. Now, they've been wandering through the desert, crabby on and off here and there, but all of a sudden, because he's a little late, they get impatient. And so they create this golden calf to worship. And so Moses and God have this conversation because God is mad. And God says, you know, they turned away from me. He goes, all that I've done for them, leading them out of bondage into freedom, and they're worshiping someone else. They're worshiping a false god now. And so it's kind of interesting because Moses intercedes on behalf of the people and says, you know, they really are good. You know, they just have erred, they just have sinned, they've turned their back on you. Remember how merciful you are. Remember how great you are in your kindness and in your compassion. And so God relents and doesn't punish them. And then Paul, who often in his writings talks about he was one of the biggest persecutors, he was one of the biggest sinners, and therefore felt like that strength of God's mercy was especially poured out on him. And so much so that it led him to a life of preaching that good news of God. And then our gospel today includes that very well-known parable of, we often call the prodigal son. It's also sometimes referred to as the giving father or the forgiving father. But the first sentence, I think, really sets the tone for it when it says, a man had two sons. And so right away we know that there's going to be a difference in the two sons. Both of them, in their own way, stand in need of God's mercy. We kind of think it's only the first son who says, you know, Dad, can I have all my inheritance? He gets it, he goes away, squanders it, has to eat what he's feeding the pigs, and then comes back and says, you know, I'm no longer able to be called your son. Forgive me and treat me as one of your servants. And we know the dad goes racing out to meet him, doesn't even wait for him to make it all the way home, and forgives him and celebrates by putting sandals on his feet and killing the fatted calf. The young son's sin, the young son's way of turning his back on what he knew to be true, which was not only the love of his father, but the love of God, was in thinking that he did not need authority in his life. He could be his own person. No one was going to tell him what to do. He was going to go make something of himself by himself. And so we're reminded of those areas in life where perhaps we feel that same way, where we don't need anybody giving us suggestions. We don't need anybody offering us correction. We don't need to listen to anyone because we have it figured out ourselves. The second son, when his younger brother returns, is mad. And he says to his dad, you know, you didn't give me a party ever, and I stayed right here. And he doesn't even go in the house to join in the celebration. And so what he is saying, he's said yes to this authority in his life by staying with his dad, but now he's saying, I don't need my brother. I don't need to share it with anybody else. I don't need to celebrate the good fortune of others. I don't need to be concerned about the life of others. I'm only going to be concerned for myself. And so again, friends, each of us has our area where we fall short of what God is asking of us, where we fall short in our relationships with one another, with our prayer life, with our willingness to be generous. but we know that coming before God with those failings, with those sins, that God is always racing out there, ready to welcome us, ready to forgive us, ready to let us try again.